So we'll record this conversation so we can post it later. We had a lot of people who couldn't make it this afternoon for this time. So we'll have that all going, and we'll share it as soon as we can. Um, so we'll have that up and running. What we'll do today, really quickly, is introduce ourselves, get it going, the five panelists, and then try to give you a quick little overview of what each of us have to share, and then work into Q&A, which we think will be able to be a nice open discussion. We ask if people can stay on mute when they're not talking, and we'll watch the chat. It might be easiest to use chat, but we're happy to open it up to conversations as well. It's just with about 50 people could get a little bit of cacophonous, as it were. But again, thanks again for joining us on this Friday afternoon. What we really thought would be fun, and this was sort of started, and I'll let us get into intros, is just to do something for the community around how we can think about ways to share the stuff and the work we're doing, both informally and formally within communities and trying to reach new communities. And that was sort of the genesis of this conversation. And I'd just like to really quickly do a hop around for the panel. For those who don't know, my name is Drew Davidson. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon and the founder of Play Story Press, which was sort of started while I was doing a study around the field during my sabbatical. And you all are amazing, and that led to let's roll the publishing imprint up that was run more by the community. So that's me really quickly. Brad, you want to say who you are?
Hi, everybody. My name is Brad King. I am the managing editor at Carnegie Mellon in the University Libraries, but for many years I was the editorial director and editor at the ETC Press, and with Drew helped start Play Story Press. I've been a little bit more behind the scenes than I was at the ETC Press, but that will be changing over the next few months. I've worked in publishing in all its various forms for most of my career, 25 years, and have been working with Drew since 2006 on these kinds of initiatives. Built a writing collective in the Midwest with 800 people that publish books and things like that. So excited to talk about all the different ways that we've done that over the years. And I know some people here, so it's nice to see people I know, and it's nice to meet everybody who's new.
Thanks, Brad. Next up, Dave Thomas. You want to go, Dave?
You bet. Hi, I'm David Thomas. I'm here as one of the founders of Professors of Play. It's a community organization that promotes playful pedagogy in the workplace. Professionally, I'm an administrator at the University of Denver, and I still maintain my faculty appointment in architecture over at the University of Colorado. So I'm in all areas, and I'll talk more about what I've done later.
Cool. Thanks a lot, David. Next up, Zoe. You want to say hi, Zoe?
Hi everyone, I'm Zoe Wake Hyde, and I am the director of Radish Press, which is a independent experimental press that does lots of things that we'll talk about. And I'm also on the advisory board for Play Story Press. I've spent the last decade and change working in open publishing. A lot of that has been around open infrastructure, both developing publishing platforms and thinking about the kind of broader ecosystem that this work happens in. And yeah, I'm excited to share more about that. Thanks.
All right, Lindsay, it's you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Lindsay Grace, Knight Chair in Interactive Media at the University of Miami and Vice President of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance. I'm a full professor at the University of Miami. I've been doing a sort of hybrid work in the sort of publication space across both building community and creating archives of creative work, as well as doing work in sort of Black game studies and BIPOC game studies, and then doing work around trying to foster I think foundational understanding of a variety of sort of game studies topics and trying to build community around everything from affection games to critical game design, et cetera. So I'll talk in a bit about, I think, my intersection with this community, but I thought I'd just introduce myself. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindsay. So we're going to start with David Thomas. For all who don't know, this whole roundtable was his idea, so it's all his fault. But he'll give you an overview of like how he's going from like soup to nuts and creating books for the community.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. So as I mentioned, Professors of Play, I put the link in there. I want to tell the story of Professors of Play because that's going to get me from there to here, which is the publications we've been doing with Play Story. Before COVID, friend of mine, Professor Lisa Forbes, a counseling professor back at CU Denver, and I were kicking around the idea of increasing kind of, the efficacy of teaching, dealing with student engagement. She was burned out as a teacher, and I was doing lots of game studies work at the time. What makes games fun? What makes things fun? And that's how I met mostly this crew of former games, current game studies people. But anyway, the point is Lisa and I came up with this idea of, hey, we want to make teaching more fun, and we thought we were the only two people in the world. And then we found like two or three other people. And so we started this Google listserv, and it had like 6 people on it. And we'd trade little messages and little bits of stuff. And then COVID hit. And then, in case you didn't know, COVID reignited an interest in teaching, because all of a sudden all these professors were put into this environment where their students were disengaged and distressed, and there was a revived interest in how do you teach. And Lisa wrote an article for a place called Faculty Forum and explained playful pedagogy and explained how it had reignited her love of teaching and how it really re-engaged her students in the educational work. And this blew up. Suddenly our list went from 6 people to 100, 200, 300, 400. It kept growing. It capped out at about 1,000. Well, while this list was growing, we were quite surprised. And of course, everyone was asking us, tell us more, tell us more. And we were kind of like, we told you everything we already know in that one article. But we recognized the opportunity, and we're very energized and excited. So we did our first Playposium. It was a Zoom call. About 100 people internationally showed up, and we had all these professors sharing their work, and it was really exciting and energizing. And so it became an area of focus and discipline and research for us. We decided Professors of Play needed a website, and we had a conference, and so we did another Playposium. And then people were asking, we need techniques. We need to know how to do this. And so we decided, oh, we need to collect all these techniques. And so we were looking for a place to put this all together and publish it. And this is when ETC is alive and kicking. And I reached out to Drew and Brad and described the project, and they were interested in it. And so, long story short, we put together this book. This is the Professors at Play online play, or Professors at Play book. This came out 2 years ago. And it's a collection of essays, research, and mostly techniques by about 80 professors from all over the globe. Now, the reason this is interesting to me is I want you to understand that the community developed before the publication. The publication was a means to serve the public, to serve the community. What happened, though, much to our surprise, is this book has been downloaded over 10,000 times and growing. So when you look at, research impact, I mean, this is off the charts. I mean, it doesn't get cited nearly as much as maybe some things would, but it's out in the bloodstream, and part of that was made possible by the ETC platform, by the commitment to open access publishing, and also it just struck a nerve with people. So this established, this approach to publishing that I think was bound to happen anyway, where a community of practice, a community of scholars and researchers had already come together. Then the publication started to be produced to feed that group, grow that group, and grow that interest. And ETC was the perfect platform for it, because they were super flexible about how we organized this, about how we produced it. Brad didn't even argue with me too much when we said we wanted to put an octopus on the cover. Because we wanted it, because that's kind of the mascot of Professors at Play. So anyway, so to flash forward where we are today, AI hit last year in a big way in higher ed, and we produced a small book. It's a little micro publication, the Professors at Play AI Playbook. It was a quick shot, one shot, 50 pages, full color, did it through, this one went through Play Story, to just sort of say, hey, here's how to use Play to kind of engage this topic of AI. Then just about a month ago, we finished this one, the Professors at Play online playbook. Same platform, same approach, and how we produced it real quick for those of you that are interested, and then I'll throw these links into the chat. Here's how you do it. You put a call out on your website, you get lots of participants, you send out a template, they write content, you put the content. I put the content into like 50, 60 Word documents. I dropped all those Word documents into something called it's Literature and Lattes tool. Anyway, it allowed me to organize all those files into a master document. I output the master document. We edited it at Word, And then from that, we dropped it into InDesign. I'm not a designer, but the tools are sophisticated enough that we were able to create all of the layout in InDesign. We used Adobe Express to do the graphics and the titles and everything. Then we put everything into the Lulu Press templates. We work with Play Story on the kind of the wrappers, and then it's done. And I'm like saying, you're saying, where's the editorial oversight? The editorial oversight all happens internally within the editors that we use. And then I would say, where's the peer review? The peer review is happening right now. I mean, it happened in the editorial process, but the peer review is, this is the book, this exists, everyone gets to have a shot at it, it's open access. Publisher replies. So that's me in a nutshell, long nutshell, big nutshell. All right.
All right, thanks a lot, David. I think that gives you a great sense of just how you could start something with a community and how a community started. So, like building on that, it'd be really interesting to hear Zoe and tell the story behind Radish Press.
Oh, thanks, Drew. Yeah, so like I said, I've been working around open publishing for a long time. Sorry, was that a... Oh, sorry, someone was unmuted. I just got distracted. And, you know, some of that involved being very hands-on in terms of creating books. My focus has always been mostly in the humanities and social sciences, so books is my thing more than journals. And I spent a long time in open education, so working on textbooks. And that was a really interesting space to kind of explore how we create a replicable model of publishing so that it's accessible to everybody. Because the way that the press system is set up, it makes the process really opaque. And there's this expectation in a lot of cases that, you know, the author hands off a manuscript and 2 to 5 years later, they get handed back a book, right, that they can hold in their hands. And with that kind of approach, it's really hard to get in there, to innovate, to kind of claim some of the power of knowing how to do publishing. And so open education was a really interesting space to challenge that, because there are library publishing programs who wanted to be doing that work. And so with that, I was working on a project called Rebus Community, and we developed a book about how to publish open textbooks. And that was kind of a first foray into a replicable model. And it was also really centered on the idea of community and collaboration, because in that space, people are motivated to do this work. And so being able to understand how to bring people into a project, how to distribute the work amongst many people, those kinds of things were really interesting to explore. Since then, I worked more on things like publishing platforms, and if you're familiar with Knowledge Commons, which was Humanities Commons before, and to be honest, I just really missed doing publishing things. And so for a bunch of reasons, I started Radish Press, quit my relatively cushy job at a US-based university, although I might have had good timing there, and I now run Radish Press full-time. And so it's a press founded on the idea that publishing is a really powerful thing, that who decides what can get published when and by who is a really important kind of process to think about critically. And a lot of that power is concentrated in presses at the moment. The amazing thing about community-based approaches, like we're talking about here today, is that they redistribute that power and they allow people to be connecting with the audiences and the publics and that they want to be reaching, rather than kind of outsourcing this whole part of what it means to create and share knowledge to a traditional publisher. So with Radish Press, I do publishing, which is great. I have kind of my first title that I'm working with, which is an interactive digital book. And I'm also working, I'm funding it essentially through contract work with things like the Next Generation Library Publishing Project, and do some kind of production editorial support. And I work with the Public Knowledge Project on their book platform. So I'm tying all of these things together rather than saying, okay, a press is just going to develop a list of things to publish. And then in addition to that, I'm using it to host some projects, one of which is the Community Publishing Garden, which I will put some links in about and invite you all to. So that's a project I undertake with a collaborator in the UK, where we just recently got funding from the Open Book Collective, essentially to do some community development work around community publishing. Lots of kind of meta layers to it. And the idea being that the way that people are figuring out on their own to do these things, exactly as David, you were just describing, exactly as Play Story Press does, there is so much knowledge there that we can be sharing amongst ourselves and bringing more people into this space of doing community publishing. And that giving some gentle structure to that is going to help us proliferate more of this approach. So as I say, I'll drop some links in, and we're in a community consultation period at the moment. So everybody's kind of welcome to be a part of that. And so really, I kind of start very big at that place of publishing as power, and we need to think about who and how we do it, and then get right down into the hands-on, what are people publishing and how. And so a particular interest of mine has been non-traditional formats. I want to find a better name for that because we're still positioning ourselves in relation to books and journals. So for example, I have a zine series that I'm getting up and running, and I am taking that zine series, I'm getting an ISSN, I'm getting a DOI, I am distributing it to whatever indexes I can. I'm working with a group called Tote on that. Again, I'll drop a link. And so I'm really experimenting with how to get a non-traditional format into the existing publishing and scholarly publishing channels that are available to us, because that dissemination piece is, to me, the thing that a publisher should be doing, right? And it should be doing it in collaboration with the creators who often know their communities and their audiences best. I mean, I love what you said, David, that you had the community before you had the publication. That's, a really beautiful thing, and that's absolutely how it can go. With the publisher then kind of acting as a facilitator more than an authority in the process. Drew, you'll recognize that term. We've talked about this publisher as facilitator thing a lot. So those systems that exist, we can use them to our advantage, and we should. And, I think kind of while a closing thought, the thing that I think comes first in all of this is people. That when you put people first in your approach to creating and publishing, magic happens, and that magic looks like the connections and the joy that we find in the relationships around it. And that if you start from that place where you are communicating with people who you are invested in and who are invested in you and your work, the infrastructures can and should support that. And two, they should allow that to be translated in ways that are more legible to the academy and the kind of structures that do, validate work, and particularly in terms of tenure and promotion, right? Like these don't need to be mutually exclusive. You can publish in community and publish for community, and also set your work up so that it is visible and checks the boxes that it needs to, in the ways that the publications traditionally have been used to kind of validate and demonstrate academic work. So I'll leave it there for now. Very excited for any questions.
Thanks a lot, Zoe. That was awesome. So next up, Lindsay.
All right. So I'll first talk from a Knight Chair perspective, and then I'll give you some sort of history in the way that I've developed some of the publications that I'm involved with. So the Knight Chair, basically, there's about 26 of us who are responsible for sort of bridging the gap between the professional world and the news world. And what's really nice about this is that Knight itself is really engaged in trying to support open access. They want the most wide access. And that's been great in terms of both university pressure, because I know for those of you who are academics, one of the challenges of course, meeting that pre-tenure and post-tenure expectation. And sometimes open access doesn't always fit in there. But when you have organizations like Knight saying, no, open access is the right way to do it, don't put it behind $180 paywall so that people pay a tremendous amount for your book. And I'll say that because 2 of my books are behind one of those giant paywalls. I've found that it's been really great for developing community around specific topics. So back when it was ETC Press, we did this Black Game Studies book, and then we followed up with Play Story Press, which is a newer, cooler version. And one of the things that we did was really try and foster a sense of opportunity for people who had ideas but didn't necessarily know how to get in a book. And so I spent a lot of my time being the sort of editor, mentor, and I've had that experience before because I was really engaged in doing this for artists as well. So one of the challenges we have in arts is that it's often ephemeral work. It's sort of, if you weren't there at the gallery at that time, or if you didn't pick up the curatorial booklet, then you didn't actually learn about the project. And so one of the frustrations I had for a lot of these artists was that we really wanted to foster sort of something that wasn't ephemeral. And so for DIGRA, the Digital Games Research Association, we did these blank arcade booklets. And for the Smithsonian American Art Museum, we did the same thing. And they were published as sort of open access, low cost opportunities to get a view of work that you might not have been able to see in Washington, D.C. And I'll drop those kinds of, I'll drop a bunch of links to that kind of work for you, just so you have a context for it. But really, I think one of the things that's really essential in understanding a lot of the value of doing any kind of publishing this way is that it can help foster a sense of community that blossoms into something more. So with the Black Games book, we're now running something called the BIPOC Games Conference, which is a lot of the contributors, and we've expanded it to something that's going to keep going. So the Strong National Museum, and I'll drop that link in too, in New York, has sort of said, this is great, we need to do more. And we've sort of facilitated with a single sort of rallying cry, a book, we've been able to sort of facilitate much more action, which I think is a really great way to support community. I'll keep it brief so that you can ask any questions. Yeah, I'm wide open to answering. And I'll drop a bunch of links of things I just mentioned in chat.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Lindsay. So we're going to wrap with Brad and I just talking about Play Story Press and sort of philosophy behind that, and then just open it up to discussion and Q&A. And I think, like we were trying to, some of you were really thoughtful in sharing questions before, and I'm trying to keep track of that to make sure we address that. If you feel like we haven't gotten it in a way, don't be shy about bringing it back up. But with Play Story Press, one of the things that we thought, sort of building on the experience we had with ETC Press, like I mentioned at the top, I had a sabbatical for 2024, and I was doing this study in the field, or just talking to almost anybody from anywhere around how they felt their work or their interests or their life related to play from their perspective. I was trying to be very open-ended on that. And it just was inspiring. I talked to athletes and musicians and game designers and academics and child psychologists and the people out of theater. It was just this wonderful thing that got me thinking about what could be the next step for a press that became more of the community. So then I started negotiating with CMU to go, hey, I'd love to spin something out. And they were very, very supportive about allowing us to do the only thing, like, well, we're going to keep the name ETC Press. So part of the negotiations was us spinning it out. Everything was open access, so it was easy in a lot of ways, and everything was also what we thought was powerful about the new model as we started talking to people in the community and other organizations like David with Professors at Play, and you can kind of find some stuff on our website. I'll drop some links in there about, we formed a sort of like an open publishing consortium of about 24 other nonprofit organizations like DIGRA, and the SASGC, the Foundation's Digital Game Crowd, Meaningful Play, a lot of people, Arden, the Interactive Narrative Group. We were just curious about ways that we could support each other as a community, and that like the community became the gold standard for what we were trying to do. That got me just really excited, and it seemed there were a lot of interest in doing this type of work. So we really were like, and it enabled us to be more, one of the things that we always prided ourselves throughout the years was like how quickly we could get something that we felt was timely and important. As to, like I think Zoe was saying it earlier, like sometimes, the traditional way is it takes up to 2 to 3 years for a book to hit the market. And for like the book that David mentioned earlier around AI, is like, this is really timely. We're all talking about AI in education. Could we do something with Professors at Play that just sort of addresses it in a way that the community is thinking about it? And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is like experiment in ways to get things out that are as timely as possible. But also, to a lot of the questions is like, could we support, graphic novels that are academic or something more ephemeral, like what Lindsay was saying, like how do we support something that's performative and that is in a moment? Do you do it through videos? Like we did some past issues of Things Online where they're just sort of like doing let's play videos that are more academically focused, to try to give people an opportunity to share their work in new ways. And so that's just been really powerful for us, and we've been building off of that. And again, it's like of them, by him, for the community. And so that's one of the things that we just found so inspiring. We'd hope to, in talking to David about, oh, we should do this little roundtable and talk about ways to share your information and publish stuff. We got really excited about ways to help facilitate people to take ownership of what they wanted to do and how they do it, and help just share that, and have like roundtables like this, or maybe get something where we have a nice pulse of we're doing this like bi-monthly or monthly. It's just some sort of discussion that has a focus, or just sort of like addressing a topic really quickly. Could be smaller than this, or we're just sort of like open, like ways that we can share and help the community grow and help the community sort of build towards what they need to do, because it's like, while there are intersections and the intersectionality of all these different nonprofits are there, there's also so like, Professors at Play has a unique focus that's a little different than Games for Change. But how do we help support them so that they can think about ways to discuss and deal with their communities? And maybe there are intersections, and then, be aware of where their differences are. So that's sort of, do you want to add anything you would like to add, Brad?
There is. So a large part of what I have, my expertise in this area, like I was a professor for a while, but I was at Wired way back when, and Technology Review, and now here doing this stuff, is understanding the tools that are out there to do stuff. When I lived in Indiana, I was on the board for the Indiana Writers Center, and I taught classes on how to self-publish. So I worked with people on like, here are these tools that you can do. And part of the model for the ETC Press was that we can put out books for less than about $100 to $150. We use templates and tools that are easily accessible. If you aren't technological or aren't really into that stuff, and you heard David talking about like, here's all the stuff we did, it's a little overwhelming, right? Like, he's like, it's easy. I'm like, there's 17 tools, and we actually use one tool. And a lot of what I do is work individually with groups to help them figure out how to do that. And we at Play Story Press, David's group is they're doing the design themselves, but a lot of what we do is that internal design. Largely what we're doing is not pixel heavy books, right? So like, if you want to do a coffee table book, you probably don't want to put that on a phone, right? Like getting an ebook version of that's not important. And so we look at the individual projects, and a lot of what I did over the 20 years that I worked with the ETC Press was meeting individually with authors and finding out what they were trying to do, and then finding the tools that we had access to that we could use. So I think there's two layers to this discussion, which is there are these groups that are doing these things, and then there are people like me who are also part of that world, right? Like, I had tenure, I ran a graduate lab, like I understand the sort of intricacies of being a professor and what that means, but I'm also a publisher, right? I worked at the Indiana Writers Center. I built a writing group, and we held readings, and we did online chats, and we did I taught classes, and I do workshops to teach people how to do that stuff. Like that, I think, is what the consortium's really great in that there's all these groups doing this, but I think the next layer are people like me that can then help all these groups say, how do we do this? What do we want to do? What's the easy way to do that? Because I know there's lots of tools out there. I am not fun at parties because I spend a lot of time staring at computers and playing with things and trying to figure out what are ways to solve these problems. And so I think that's sort of the second part of this, is that too oftentimes these things get spun out as like great ideas for individuals. And I think what particularly the ETC Press was trying to do, and what Play Story Press is trying to do, is also have that second layer of like, we can do some of this stuff for you. We don't get paid for it, right? Like, it's a volunteer organization, it's a nonprofit, but like Drew and I have been doing this since 2006. Like it's not a fly by night thing for us. And so I think that would be the only other thing. So like, one of the propositions Drew and I have talked about is finding like what we don't have as a designer, right? So we've traditionally, at the ETC Press, we had a mechanism to get covers and things like that. We don't need internal design, but we may be looking for like a third volunteer to help us do covers. Because if we can do covers, I can do all the internal stuff. I can work with people on editing and peer review and things like that. Rue has been doing the yeoman's work on this stuff now for reasons that I'll tell you all when we're not recording it over a beer somewhere. And like, but he really, like, we want him being front faced and focused out to help spread the word, right? So that we have those 3 layers of build community, do the work, and then get it out. So I think that would be the only other thing for those maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by the technology. Like, at least at Play Story Press, you'll be working with me. If you can ask people, sometimes that's good. I try to be happy. But anyway, that
Zoe,
would be
you had a
my sort
comment.
of pitch.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah.
Zoe wanted to build on that. And then we'll open it up to general discussion.
Brad, yeah, if we found each other at a party, I could talk for hours about the tools of it all. And I love what you're saying, because it's really important that, like, when you're taking on doing publishing, you don't have to develop all of this expertise as one individual person. Doing it in a community-based way means that you bring together people who have different interests, different experiences, and that again is take a similar approach as Brad with Radish Press of, okay, I want to talk to the people involved in a project and understand what their needs are. So this interactive book that I mentioned, they really wanted to use Scalar, which is a tool I've never used before, but I'm aware enough of it. And I'm like, great, cool. They have their reasons for wanting it. What I can do is host it for them, set up the domain, manage it, make sure that it's connected into, being able to issue DOIs, whatever else. Like, I can do that piece of the work so that they don't have to, and that they don't have to think about, okay, well, what does it mean if we're hosting our own instance of this? Do we have to deal with all the technical, side of that when these are 2 editors who are full-time academics who are, love their subject, want to publish, but shouldn't have to know that level of the mechanics. And at the same time, by working with them, I always kind of try and prioritize, like, developing that knowledge and capacity where people do want it, right? Like, making sure that that's being shared amongst our different communities. This goes to the community publishing garden idea, that, like, that sharing of knowledge allows more communities to come together who have enough people with the right experience and interest in the different layers of the kind of publishing process.
What you got, David?
I just wanted to as a thread that I think goes through all of this is this kind of hunch that scholarly publishing might be broken. And these are all different solutions to trying to fix the fact that scholarship's probably never been more important in terms of the dialogue, in terms of the discovery. And so I feel like that we're all in different ways with different kinds of platforms and approaches, trying to answer the question, how do we get people talking about important things critically? And I want to just say that's why I'm here. More publishing almost sounds awful because I can't read everything that's out there, but the alternative sounds even worse. And I love the fact that now I have 10 more books from just this conversation that I need to download and skim through, maybe read. So that's it.
Brad has a hand up.
Go, Brad. What you got?
Sorry, you were muted. So I
know.
think I put it in the chat pod, but like the other thing that's really important, I know we do it, and I did it with Lindsay, I did it with David, I've done it with a bunch of people, is that sometimes it's good if when you're putting together the idea of the book, I spend a lot of time how might we discussions, because like, we don't need you to be the experts in what can be done, right? Like, what we want to do is find out where you want to go. And then it's at least I can only speak for Play Story and ETC Press. Well, only Play Story. That's our job, is to figure out, like, hey, well, this road goes this way, this road goes this way, this road goes this way. Here will be the things that do and don't work. And we've done this for so long. We don't see everything, but we kind of know where to put the flashlight to be like, I think there's probably going to be a bump there. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, when I came on full time at CMU in 2017, part of what we wanted to do was move things. We still do textbooks, we still do journals, we still do academic publishing, but we also do some trade facing stuff that isn't necessarily traditionally like something HarperCollins is going to publish, but we look at different models for like things like singles, which are like long form essays that we publish as books that are more front facing and more. I always tell people they're like they are why it matters books, right? Like you're sitting in a bar and you tell somebody like, "Oh my God, this," and they're like, "Why do I care?" It's an essay based in science and research about why a topic matters. And I'm not going to say that I was prescient, but part of the issue that we're facing in the world right now is people don't even understand why science and research matter. So it's good that we do the academic stuff, but I also think that it's important for these kinds of tools to be used to explain why things matter. And we have an ability to do that I think more traditional publishers don't. Like Nature does a little bit of it, but it's always in like big sky. Like they've done really great stuff explaining the NSF, but I'm like, my mom and dad ain't reading Nature. Well, my dad passed away. Nope, he's not reading anything. But so like figuring out ways for us to publish these things in meaningful ways into communities that can be shared in places that need to be shared, I think is the other thing that this really allows us to do. So having those how might we conversations at the beginning sometimes allows you as a professor to get 3 hits off one thing. Right, like I'm doing a journal article or I'm doing something in a book that's leading me into this other thing that maybe we turn into some kind of workshop, right? Like, and so that's just like thinking about this consortium and how this works. Like, that's another, I think, component for us.
All right. Well, we have a wonderful group of participants. I'd love to like front and center you all. If anybody has any questions, feel either raise your hand or type it in the chat. We're watching the chat. Happy to go over. Let's see. All right, Paul just was looking at our for author stuff. The proposal, you can either send it to editors at Play Story Press. I'll make that more clear so that it jumps out to people. Paul, we usually take proposals straight from editors at Play Story Press or Drew at Play Story Press.
Yeah,
we're open.
it goes to Drew and I are the editors.
Yeah,
So,
it goes to
yeah,
us.
yeah, starts it up.
But that's a great comment. I'll make sure it's more clear before I go to bed tonight. Um, but yeah, it was any other what's going on? What are people thinking about? How can we sort of like keep talking together?
I'd love to
Full
hear
shot.
Zoe and Lindsay, or you guys all talk about publishing outside of just books and words, right? I mean, I know Lindsay, you're talking a bit about curating multimedia. I know Zoe, that's an area. I think it's another thing that we need to be really thoughtful about. Escaping who's allowed to produce things.
I think there's 2 ways to look at it too, and I've been playing the game on both ends. So most of my tenure roles have actually been between departments or not in departments at all. And so trying to check boxes in multiple places sometimes means presenting it in ways that are recognized as journals, but also in ways that actually champion the work and express the work the way it was intended to be. So I think what Brad was emphasizing is really important, that the how we might do X is a really important question. And it's, I think, one of the most successful I've seen in terms of career advice for folks is to sort of say, here's what they're going to evaluate me by, or this is how I'm going to get noticed, or this is how I'm going to get my word out. But also this work only is understood in this way. And I like, it goes all the way back, and not to be too technical, to making sure that almost everything I do on the website side is HTML and CSS, and I don't get real smitten with very specific cool tools that do great stuff and then fail to work 3 weeks from now because Firefox doesn't support it. And that's actually why I think it's important to do both. So making sure, for example, that those books have multiple images, both screenshots and exhibition shots of someone's work, so that they're at least that archive. And a lot of the structures, and I emphasize it a lot of the structures that are archival are still about 30 to 80 years back. So we do have to find a way to make sure that they can still do the work that they do, which means giving them a PDF that they can index. And it just, to me, it's just an unfortunate reality. But I have seen some cool stuff on the other end where it's like we're archiving this digital experience. But honestly, archive.org does a great job of it. So we try to
Oh,
do
yeah.
some more of that, like, please index this, than try to be pros on that end because it's a huge task in itself.
Yeah, and I know Zoe probably knows this more than I do, but we've been exploring relationships like we work with the Knowledge Commons to help archive and disseminate our stuff, and they give us DOIs. But also, like she mentioned, Toth at the top of like working with these organizations to help think about how you can create metadata that makes it easy to disseminate it out into various channels, since it'll have a more consistent sort of a format on what it is you're publishing and why. And so we're building on that again, sort of to Brad's point. We can't all be experts about everything. Like one of the things I saw, Carrie, your question in there about publishing and crediting games. We have done that both through ETC Press and Play Story Press, where we've done board games partnering with the Game Crafter, because they do publish on demand and they're willing to work with us. But it is hard, like to like Brad's earlier point, we helped with one of the designers and developers of a game to not only do the game, but to write a single for us. So that she sort of got this two hit where she's like, okay, you're doing this amazing game, but if you do this short thing to help articulate why it's so important, it'll just help sort of like resonate with that game you've made and help to, like Lindsay's point of sometimes your committees or your university's going, well, where's the text? That like I had a colleague who developed, I saw one of the questions that came through online was about escape games. She said, could you do that? And he created some escape games for his campus. And the way he got sort of accreditation for it was like doing this really nice job of documenting. And all documenting was really just taking pictures, really writing up his rule set and getting that published within sort of like an article. So it's like trying to like strike that balance of like, I'm trying to do something really different, but also get it somewhere that so that my dean or something can go, oh, I see what you're doing and how it has value, as opposed to I don't understand why that YouTube video is scholarly work.
Yeah, the other thing is I've written letters and then give it to Drew on letterhead. Like I ran tenure committee when I was a professor. And so being able to say, here's the process we went through, here's our collective, here's how this works, here's what will come out. Like I've written several of those for folks just to have documentation, particularly for things that either are coming out or may seem like people can't exactly tell how it's happened. So, and then Drew's name goes on that because nobody cares that a staff member wrote it.
The other thing, just to go back to make sure that that was clear, is when you guys had said that you were the editors, I think it's important for people to recognize that we still go through it, like Play Story Press still goes through editorial review. So I've written those like reviews and said, oh, this looks like it's going to work, or I think they're not aware of this other body of literature that's already been here.
Yeah, we try to build that on with our community.
There's a thread through here around, you know, the publication being an expression of the work and not like the final, the be all and end all work. And that way you can express the work through multiple different channels in multiple different formats. So that idea of having a, you know, a written accompaniment to a published board game. It's brilliant. I love it. My personal ambition is I want to publish a set of oracle cards, because it is a valid expression of research. If it's on a theme, say, you know, if it's about like birds, and I'm from New Zealand, so New Zealand birds, you can use something like a deck of cards or an oracle deck to share information about them. And there's every reason for that to be considered scholarship as much as an article written for a journal on, you know, on the same subject. And so kind of thinking about these different pieces making up a whole rather than each of them being their own end point, I think kind of opens up some of these possibilities around different formats, and allows for some fun to enter into the picture as well, because it's a lot more fun to make a board game than it is to write a really, really traditional scholarly monograph for some people, at least. I'm sure some people absolutely love writing a traditional monograph, and more power to them, but there's room for more than that.
Yeah. Totally agree. And I think too, like building on some of the questions that are, I see I'm tracking the chat and looking at some of the questions that were submitted earlier, like one of the things we've always tried to do when we're having conversations with people is like, here's our model and what we do. So like we're not able to provide advances. We're not, but we're able to talk to you about ways to think about if you'd rather go more traditional. And for some people, that's a necessity. There are ways to consider about that, like how you pull together a proposal, how you develop those relationships, and stuff like that. And also kind of like looking at the work David's done through Play Story Press, or like Zoe, like she's like, I quit my job because I'm committed to this. I'm going all in on Radish Press. They like how you sort of negotiate and think about that community, or finding people who are doing it and looking for ways to then find that sort of like-minded resonances. They're like, all right, this is something's going on here. How do we share a little bit better? It could start as just a website. It could start as a D list. It could start as, and there's like ways you can build towards that. And there's just a variety of things, like Lindsay being the night chair in Miami, like some of the stuff that you start trying to think of doing that we did at Carnegie Mellon with ETC Press, and talking to some other people. It's like, can you leverage what's going on at your university to provide you a way to do some publications? Because some universities have great presses and you can work on that. And some, like Stanford just shut theirs down. And so it's in flux even at a university level of what it means, because publishing is weirdly, it's like, how do you lose the least amount of money? And it's become more, depends on administrations of like, with Stanford, they're like, we can't justify that we're always losing money on this. And so like, I think that built towards some of the things that we were thinking of, ways to make arguments and do stuff. And Brad's got some comments, so go for it, Brad.
No, I was just, Paul had a question in the chat and I was like, oh, Drew, you should address that one. And then Zoe jumped in there.
There you go. Yeah, and so does Toth. I think Toth has like an export to latex. Am I right, Zoe? I think I saw that. I think it can incorporate. I'm pretty sure.
Possibly, but not. Tote doesn't work so much with the full text. It's
Right.
stores the metadata, and so I think you can export the metadata in lots of different formats. But for like full text typesetting of a work, just the other week I was in a conversation about this, and so I just need to go find the name of the thing that was said out loud. But it's very possible to go from LaTeX to a typeset work.
Yeah, and I also I know in terms of what we do, like Paul, like I will work with people who want us to put their books together, but all we need to do is tell you it's 6x9. Here's the template. So if you can use any tool to author and export it into a standard format, you can use the thing that you want to use with us. Like that's all part of that initial, how might we, or what are you trying to do? Or, so our website is really right now the books are kind of in one place, but like we said, we have games, we have we have linked to an actual downloadable game, and we had the ETC Press. So we're more concerned about making the product that somebody wants. As long as you have the skills to do a thing, we can usually find an answer for how to get that done.
Yeah. And like building on like not only like different types of formats, we're really curious about different types of modalities, and it's been interesting because that's always been something like, hey, we'll do games. Could we do something digital? Could we do something interactive? And what's been fascinating is people are interested, but there's so much interest in publishing topically in this area that we've been drowned in text. And it's sort of like, well, we want to serve that community. So it's been this back and forth for us of like, well, we hope we could support, like, we're really curious about working more with Arden, because the organization around interactive narratives, they are trying to develop tools. And we also have blanking on the acronym, so many acronyms, the Interactive Fiction Technology Foundation, the folks that do Twine, are part of our consortium. So we're really curious about ways to like, could we work with some of our consortium members to have tools that enable us to work with authors that do multimedia, interactive type work that we could archive and have hosted, so that people could kind of point to that. And I know somebody asked, like they said they're about to host a conference, like, and we do reach out with partners. There's a couple ways that we do this, and I know we're doing it with like Lindsay with BIPOC, and we do it with professors at Plays. We're very curious about how do we serve as just a facilitator, help you share. And we sort of work to develop a partnership where we understand that your process resonates with our Diamond Open Access philosophy of having things be free for authors to publish and a free version to read for readers. So we don't charge fees. No, right now we fundraise, and we do post stuff up on Lulu, and we do get I don't know, a dinner's worth of royalties every year. So we are fundraising and stuff like that.
A
We've
cheap
had some
dinner.
people.
A cheap dinner.
We do have one of the things that we've done at Play Story Press is we've had some people who had grants behind their research, so we're not charging fees, but they submitted a donation to the press to support an open access version just because they had a grant to pay for a fee. So that's an important distinction. We don't require any fees. If you don't have anything, we still want to publish you and work your way through and go through the process and support getting your work out and about.
Well, and
But
part of the reason that it's a nonprofit now too, and not through CMU, is that we're looking for a way to make it sustainable. When it was the project that Drew ran, it was a project. And I was on to do that, but we were sort of at the mercy of what's happening. And this consortium model allows us, again, we're still doing the same work we were always doing. But the whole pitch behind the ETC Press originally in Play Story was that we can do these fast and at a relatively low cost and allow people to keep their copyrights, to not be charging exorbitant fees, like all of the things that are part of the business of publishing. We were like, that is not a model that we need to do, and it shouldn't be a model around that. So 90% of my conversations with people are always like, but what's it cost? And I'm like, it really doesn't cost anything. Like, we are raising money because it costs money, but you're not going to get an invoice or bill about doing it. So like, it's one of those things that people don't believe, and then they go through it and they're like, oh my God. Like, yeah.
Well, part of
Yeah.
it, I think when I talk about cost, and this builds on some of the things we're saying, the cost is your time. It's more collaborative. Like, we really kind of lean into like, well, we'll help you think about how to do a cover. We, like Brad said, we have some volunteers, we have some people who have design skills, but I know just from working with graphic design firms, they'll charge $500 to design a cover. And an open access book might never make that back, or it might take 2 to 3 years to make that back. And so we feel like that's not a sunk cost financially. So it's more like, we'll help you think about ways to develop your cover and so on. And we've had authors come to us and go, please, 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 we want a cover and we want guarantee that no artificial intelligence was used, because we, and I totally philosophically believe that as well. So we're like, all right, we're working with volunteers, or we're helping you think about how to make your cover. So it's much more collaborative, where you share the work with us, as opposed to like we take on everything and this magically a book pops out. So people get a little bit more directly involved.
I think it's important to recognize that it's not pay to play, but there is labor involved in there. I think that this is actually a much more labor intensive approach, but it also gives you a lot of autonomy and a lot of flexibility, which I think when I work with traditional publishers, sure, they give me 16 images for my book cover and they can do them thematically and all that sort of stuff, but the labor is valuable. So just don't forget that. Yeah.
And you own it. That's the other thing for us, is that you own the thing that you do. You are not turning over anything to us. We are a Creative Commons publisher, and like that, I know the open access is important to some people, but the as a writer, as an editor, as a creator, that's super important to me as well.
Yeah, one of the things that we built on, we believe that now is true when we were doing ECC Press. I remember the CME lawyers were very much like careful about writing the contract so that it was CMU had an irrevocable license, even if it was Creative Commons, and that was totally fine. We decided to go even more author first and offer the forward with Play Story Press, and there is a termination clause in the contract. So if you ever like, I want to own this and I'd love for you to take it down, like you have control of where it goes from here with us, and we thought that was really important to just give as much control to that, because it's yours.
I can give you
just philosophically.
I can give everyone a very concrete example of the benefit of that. So I sort of tour all over the world trying to teach certain things like social impact game design. And I go to countries that are not going to pay $148 a copy of text. And I have gone back to an editor on my first book, and it has been very difficult to find a version of that that I could actually share in Malaysia. But if it is something that I've done with Play Story, it's trivial. And that's huge because it really is about offering. I mean, I produce this work because I want people to do more of it, not because I'm never going to make a profit on this. I'm in the wrong field if the idea was to get rich.
Right. And we've had some authors who are very self-promotional to their benefit, where they're like, we're going to put up a website, we're going to start, like they've got that thing where we're going to have a social media presence and put ourselves out there as an expert. And that's, well, how can we support you? Like, but that was driven by them, like the labor was them. And then I remember a question came up like, how do you publish in and from, the global South as opposed to, and we have talked to people not only like in mostly I just have a lot of contacts in Brazil for some reason. Talking to people in Brazil in ways to help they support it through the organizations that are there, and thinking about ways to work with organizations, communities there, and we're happy to support it and get it out, but it kind of like leans on that sort of your on the ground expertise of the area you're in. We also talked to people in Africa, which is huge, but CME has presence in Rwanda, and we've got some colleagues up in South Africa who we talked to about ways to help provide different perspectives. And I know DIGRA cared a lot about this. We were doing game research. The Digital Games Research Association is setting up regional groups and subsections of them, and then we're trying to help them plan out ways to publish stuff. And like we've actually some of the newer issues of the DIGRA transactions of DIGRA are multilingual. I think the next one's going to be in Chinese, so we're working with them where, because we're definitely working with them. We're like, hey, I'm happy to help with editing, but if everything's going to be put in a different language, we're going to rely on you to do the copy editing and stuff like that. Because I know so much, only so much. So like, I think there's just ways, again, like building with your community and stuff like that.
So I think Travis, you typed something earlier, and maybe you want to jump on the mic and clarify, but I took it to be, with this kind of crazy hippie publishing we're all doing, what happened to the legitimacy of the big academic press or, New York publishing imprint? Anyone want to talk about how do you pick your niche and then make it credible without all the apparatus?
So I will just talk about how we developed our thing, because the ETC Press was, I think, I don't want to say it was the first, but we're clearly one of the larger like presses that sort of took this on. And a big thing that was thrown at us was we were a vanity press, right? And they're like, well, you're just a vanity press. And you all don't know me, but I've worked really hard on like myself to not be mad about things and to take them in stride. But that was one that really, really would upset me, because every project was different, right? Like every project was different. When they're doing a journal, we published a well-played journal. There's a peer review process for that, right? Like that is all done peer review. When we're publishing DIGRA, there is a peer review process for that. Like it's the opposite of a vanity press. When people were pitching us books that were more trade oriented, we have an editorial board that we operated more like a big five publishing house or an indie like Tin House or small publisher, where we had an editorial board that we would send this out to and get feedback from and make decisions. And we didn't take everybody's stuff, because there were things sometimes we were like, not a book we want to publish. There were times we were like, this is maybe too big for what we're doing. There were times where we're like, I don't think this is a book. I don't think they can pull that off, right? It's the opposite of a vanity press. It didn't take a whole lot to set that up. I mean, Drew, I'm speaking for you because you set up the advisory board, but in terms of like managing it, like it was me sending out emails to people, giving them time, putting together forms. Each of the groups that we were publishing that did peer review had their systems in place, instead of us trying to jam them into a thing that we've made that is complicated and is probably too much, right? Like we were trying to be fast and nimble. And then we commissioned things, right? Like we went out and said, we want you to do a single on this topic, right? Like when we did Drew, what was the game about poverty?
Bro.
I can't remember broke the game. I was like, we can't just put out a game about poverty. There's a story as to why that game was developed, and that's important. And so we made an editorial decision about this is the thing we want to do. And so for us, it was really just a matter of saying, how does an academic publisher work? How does a trade publisher work? And then how does like a magazine work, which is sort of what we think about on those commission pieces, which we didn't ask the editorial board. We were like, we are experts in this field, and this is a thing that needs to happen. And so, yeah, like I know it doesn't exactly, but it didn't take a lot of work. You got to manage it. But if you know how publishing works, you can set those processes up.
Go, Zoe.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry for the rant.
We all have the minutes. Travis, I'm just seeing your comment in the chat asking about like how to navigate the waters that are patrolled by gatekeepers, and it's very real. And again, that's where I say the systems that are in place, we can kind of use them, we can stretch them, right? We can stretch the systems that already exist, and when we need to, look as legitimate as we need to, and then in other places where it's less, risky to do so, or just more appropriate to do so, lean into the kind of radical nature of what we're doing. But things like, to go back to Tote, again, they're just a favorite of mine, that with through their service, the metadata for a book or a work can be distributed to indexes like the Directory of Open Access Books. Great. They have a requirement that a book must be peer reviewed. So you have to just document your peer review process. They're pretty lenient on what that looks like, but so they've put that in so that they're doing the work of maintaining that legitimacy. And then they also distribute to things like Scopus and EBSCO and JSTOR and all these other places where your work gets mixed in with all the rest. And that, I think, is a really powerful way here to demonstrate that legitimacy. And that comes from being willing to just give it a go. Like I said, I'm trying to publish a zine as if it was a monograph. And again, that like with the publisher doing that, what I learn is how to do it for other people who want to do it, right? And like like I said, Radish Press could issue ISBNs, ISSNs, DOIs, all of the things. Like we're taking care of some of that appearance of legitimacy because, we genuinely believe it is legitimate to do work in this way. And then there are places where you're just sort of stepping into the room because you can, and taking advantage of some reflected legitimacy from who you're in the room with, essentially. And ultimately there will be hard barriers that come up. And so, we find those by going out and exploring and experimenting. And when we run into them, that's where we come back to, okay, what's our intention with this work? What's our desired outcome? What do we want to do? Is it worth it to us to kind of adapt ourselves into the box that they're presenting for us, or is it not? But there's a lot of room to play before you get to those hard barriers, for sure.
And I think like building on that sort of question about gatekeepers, one of the things that it's fun, I find it fun because it's almost like a game. It's sort of like, well, what do they look at for signs of legitimacy, or like how are they gatekeeping? And then how can like David, I love the story of Professors at Play. It was just like, at first it was just us sort of talking together. And I remember I know his colleague Lisa, who co-founded with him, and she's like, I went to a talk where he's like, how to have fun at a university, and because sometimes the university is the least fun place to have a job or be doing your doctoral studies. And so that got them thinking about like, how do we help fix this problem where I feel like people suffer within these university jobs and sort of scenarios. And that led to a lot of us responding to that. Like I signed up for professors, like you said, about 1,000 people think it's worth the next. And I remember talking to Lisa, his colleague, and she's like, year one, we had probably 40 people on the D list. Year three, we had 800. So just in 3 years, they had a community just by doing it. So some of it's like using LinkedIn, using, knowing how to do stuff. And like, I am going to date myself by saying I'm not on any social media. And I have no regrets.
He's on nothing. He's on zero things.
I am on LinkedIn just because it's my Rolodex. But I have no social media. And so it's like, but I've talked to colleagues who their careers because of what they developed through the networks they developed on social media. So it
Yeah.
can be really powerful.
I
Well-
love that. And I always say go with the momentum. Like where there is momentum because people are showing interest, follow those paths, right? That if something's kind of becoming a fight and you're not kind of sure how to get through it, go back to those spaces where other people have kind of validated the need for something or the interest in something. And it's both easier and more enjoyable to do that work.
And I
Mhm.
mean, I think to David's point and then to Drew's point, like I always like we built that thing in Indianapolis. I just put on a reading and then just kept doing stuff. Everybody wants to go to a party, nobody wants to throw it. Everybody wants to be on a boat, nobody wants to own a boat. Like if you're willing to do that and show up and do it on a regular basis, that community will build. And I think, the legitimacy, thing comes from that, right? If you build it
Yeah,
in the
it
right
follows.
way, it just does, because no matter what anybody could say, I could write letters to tenure boards and be like, this is what happened, right? Like this is how this happened. And I know how to speak that language. And then Drew would have his name on that and he would add his stuff. And it's like, so there are actually ways to to do what you're doing and go head on into those gatekeepers and be like, I know what the rules are. And so I do think
Mhm.
if you just do it and document it and do it in a way that's ethical and right, it actually is not as hard as people think. There will be some folks in the room who poo-poo it. I think enough people are, for the most part, starting to see these other ways are important.
I mean, I thought it was fascinating. Like, we were happily surprised when ACM through their digital libraries, like, we would love to join the consortium because they're going to take their digital library open access in 2026. So this huge thing that they make a lot of money on to universities, they're going to open access in just a year. And so like they're, at scale thinking like that to me was like legitimizing our approach that we started in 2006 of like open access is the future. And so I feel like one of the things that's like part of the passion that got us to spin out and do Play Story Press was like, I feel like the future is the community and it's only going to happen that way. And the tools are there now too. So it's just sort of like looking at the tools that help you make the books, looking at the tools that help you develop the community, and then just doing the work and showing up. And like it feels like magic. Things happen and people show up, and all of a sudden you've got something, and people are pointing to it as like that's important. That's
And I mean,
it's
ACM
exciting.
brought us in. Like ACM, when we
Yeah.
were at ETC Press, brought Drew and I in to do a lot of work on the back end for them, thinking about some of their publications and how they do it. So, like, I do think there's an appetite. And of everybody here, I am probably I'm not an academic anymore, right? Like, I am a staff member in the library, but they were still looking for that because these gatekeepers are understanding that things need to change. So, like, I would just keep coming back to, I think if we keep building this, I just got done watching Andor, so I'm also feeling like Fight the Empire a little bit.
Hey, something I'd throw in here too is I think that there's this notion of speed, right? And in scholarship, I think sometimes speed is the wrong term because, we're sort of taught not to go for the hot take. We're taught to spend the time to think things through, to follow, through, to do your research. And so I think that we get high centered on the idea that, scholarship inquiry takes time. What I think is exceptionally wonderful about what ETC did and what Play Store is doing is they said, yeah, that's good. It should take time to get the right ideas on paper, but when they are, it shouldn't take forever to share it. And I think
Right.
that's where some of the legitimacy conversation comes in. I think the speed that Play Story can work at makes people say, well, this couldn't be real because you didn't spend 2 years embroiled in a publishing process. And having been embroiled in the publishing process, I'm gonna tell you that's bullshit. Yes,
Mhm.
it increases quality in a lot of ways, but I don't know that that quality is offset by the delays in dissemination. So I'm way on the front end of, and again, we published the AI playbook 3 months, and we published it though as what it is. This is a hot take. using what we do to understand this, and maybe this gives you some guidance. But and I expect that book is already out of date. It's not going to be updated. It's just it's a memento of its time. So I mean, there's a time for velocity and research, but I think that if you have been working and germinating and you have something to share with the world, what's remarkable is it shouldn't take a long time to share it. There's no reason for it, and if it's not Play Story, there's other avenues. I'm going to exhort people to when the cookies are baked, get them on a plate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I put it in the chat. Like like I always think about how can you get multiple hits on your thing, right? There's multiple audiences for research that we do, and too often, like look at Ball State and guess Wiki's on here. Like I got tenure because of the Boyer model, man. Like I published 2 peer-reviewed pieces in 7 years, but I did a ton of stuff out in the public space. I was on radio. I was doing a lot of stuff, and that counted as scholarship in the model that we were under. So I was working with researchers, but then I was explaining practical applications to this research in areas. And so that thing that I put in the chat pod, Dana spent years working on
Yeah.
poverty, working in
Decades.
shelters, decades, and then made this game to try to explain what the cycle of poverty means. And then I worked with her on an essay. It's a personal essay about her journey doing the research, being homeless, trying to raise money for shelters as to why this game was built. So basically, you can't win it, right? And so we did that book in 2 months, but that book took 2 months and 20 years to do, right? So like that's the sort of heated thing that I get before when people are like, it's vanity. I'm like, this is science communication, right? And there's research, there's peer review, and there's science communication, and these are all flavors of the same thing.
Yeah. Totally agree.
Yeah. And it took, and we edited it. She had never written a piece like that. And I edited that because I'm a magazine editor, right? So like that was different than the peer review, but still, anyway.
Yeah. Well, we're
No
coming
fun
up to
fun at parties. No fun.
we're coming up on a time, and I want to respect everybody who took their evenings, mornings, late Friday afternoons if you're on the East Coast. Really appreciate your time and attention. Any last thoughts or questions before we let it go? And like I said, we'll share the recording and the transcript. We'll get it up and post it and let everybody know. And happy to keep in touch. You all have my email. And we'll keep in touch as we do stuff.
There was a lot of great links posted in the chat today. Maybe someone can aggregate that for us or export it.
Yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing. That's a great comment, David. I was going to collect the chat transcript and kind of clean it up a little, make sure we have stuff.
We'll get it on the blog for Play Story, and then we can just send it all out in sort of one nicely formatted thing.
Yeah, totally.
Like I can work on that without getting in trouble.
All right, thanks everyone. Y'all have a great rest of your day.
Brad, for all the work on ETC and Play Story, and I'd say make stuff and share stuff. That's what it's all about.
Yep. Big thanks to David, Zoe, and Lindsay. Thanks for participating.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everybody.
See y'all. Have a great one.